Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show. Coming up today, the government releases its strategy for net zero, but environmental groups threaten legal action. A small town in Minnesota is evacuated after a train carrying ethanol derails, catching alight. And the Australian government passes key legislation to cut emissions and crack down on polluters. Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show, the show where we track the changes to our world and report on some of the solutions to the climate crisis. Now, the government has today announced updated plans that it says will allow Britain to reach net zero by 2050. It's in response to legal action from Green campaigners who argue that current policies don't meet the country's legal obligations. But campaigners say the near 3,000-page strategy falls short of the ambition required and are threatening to take the government back to court. So let's take a look at some of the measures that have been announced today. Well, the Energy Security and Net Zero Secretary Grant Shapps announced a £20 billion pledge to invest in carbon capture. That's the unproven technology that plans to suck carbon back out of the atmosphere. There was also a pledge of £160 million to expand offshore wind projects, but notably not onshore wind. The government also confirmed that it would be investing more than £380 million into boosting EV charging infrastructure and a commitment to insulate 300,000 of the over 20 million homes in Britain. And there's also £240 million of funding for hydrogen projects. Plus, more details on Great British Nuclear to support the growth of the nuclear industry and an extension of the existing heat pump subsidy scheme. That'll run now until 2028. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Sky's climate change and energy correspondent, Hannah ThomasPeter, who's been speaking with Grant Shapps. So, first of all, Hannah, what did he have to say?
Well, I pressed him on whether or not he was trying to have his cake and eat it by pledging all of this decarbonisation work, but at the same time approving new oil and gas licences. He said that we simply in the UK cannot just turn off the tap, and then that's a long phased-out process. He did acknowledge, though, that on the demand side, the installation of heat pumps, which is way off track, just simply hadn't gone fast enough, and that we needed to do much more on insulating homes, and that, you know, there are millions and millions of homes that need insulation, and only a couple of 100,000 are covered in this plan. I actually asked him in the end, did he believe, could he promise the British public that this would be enough to do that very complicated tightrope walk of enhancing energy security and at the same time delivering net zero? And this is what he said.
Yes, that's exactly the plan, and the reason that I'm confident about this is I have more stake in this than pretty much anyone else, and that's because the Secretary of State is personally required by law to get us to net zero by 2050. That's not a matter of it would be quite nice to do. The ultimate sanction is that the Secretary of State can go to prison.
And Hannah, what about subsidies? Because there is a concern, isn't there, that the UK could be left behind the US and the EU as well, who are promising big subsidies to green industries.
This is all about the Inflation Reduction Act that President Joe Biden passed, $370 billion, aimed at really boosting the green revolution in the US. It's already tempting money across the Atlantic. The EU has responded with a similar kind of deal. Real concerns within the renewable industry that wind power in particular will be left behind when we generated such a good lead over the last decade and a half or so. And I think that this was in part supposed to be a response to that, but I've been speaking to people in the renewables industry this afternoon. They have said that while they welcome some of the progress that's being made, there's nowhere near enough here. They need better tax incentives. They need more capital expenditure allowance. They need to be able to write off investments for more than just 3 years, which is what the government's promising at the moment. And they are still worried, even after these announcements, that the government hasn't done enough to shore up wind power for the future in this country.
OK, Hannah, thanks very much indeed. Well, we're going to have some more expert views on that top story in a moment. But first, let's take a quick look at some of the day's other news. And in the last few hours, residents of a small town in the American state of Minnesota have fled their homes after a train carrying ethanol and corn syrup has derailed and caught fire. The train derailed in the town of Raymond, roughly 100 miles west of Minneapolis, at around 1 a.m. local time, according to a statement from the local sheriff. The rail freight industry is under intense scrutiny after a train carrying toxic chemicals derailed in Ohio last month, causing thousands to be evacuated and raising concerns about long-term health impacts. The Australian Parliament has passed landmark new laws aimed at helping the country reach its target of net zero by 2050. The so-called safeguard mechanism reforms will create a ceiling for emissions and force Australia's 215 most polluting facilities to reduce their emissions by 4.9% each year. Long seen as a laggard on emissions reduction, Australia's new Labor government says it's committed to climate action.
Australians had seen the devastating impact of climate change. It's not something that's theoretical. The bushfires, the floods, the fact that the science told us there would be more extreme weather events and they'd be more intense has tragically played out. Passing this legislation has put Australia on a realistic path to net zero emissions by 2050 and a 43% reduction by 2030.
A federal judge has ordered the US government to resume regular oil and gas lease sales on federal lands in North Dakota. The Biden administration reached a legal settlement to reassess the climate damages from the leases in September after halting the practice 2 years ago. Around a quarter of US fossil fuels come from federal lands. Now, for more on our top story now, on the government's net zero strategy, I'm joined by the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit's Head of Energy, Jess Ralston, and the Policy Director at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change at LSE, Bob Ward. So, hello to both of you. Thanks so much for talking to us. Jess, to you first of all, overall, are you impressed by the plans?
Well, the strategy today and all the government's announcements were billed as a new energy security strategy. Now, the UN, the United Nations, of course, the International Energy Agency and the UK's Climate Change Committee have all said that in order to get greater energy independence, we need to build out more renewables and reduce our gas demand in the first place through things like insulation. And on those fronts, the government strategy doesn't quite give the renewables industry what they wanted in terms of a boost of certainty that the UK is where they should invest their money, nor is there no new money announced for energy efficiency, which certainly doesn't help to reduce our gas demand.
OK, but Bob, there is a focus on new technologies, isn't there, like hydrogen, but also carbon capture storage. The hope, the government says, is that carbon capture storage could remove 50% of the emissions on this country's industry, which sounds great.
Yeah, I mean, and we are going to need carbon capture and storage, but let's be very clear that we will need it for dealing with those parts of the economy where you can't easily replace fossil fuels with alternatives, perhaps in aspects of steel industry or maybe even cement manufacture. But we shouldn't be using it really in the power industry to help us keep burning fossil fuels. That doesn't make a lot of sense, where we have a lot of cheaper alternatives in renewables, and we are seeing at the moment the consequences of our dependence on fossil fuels. It is the price of natural gas that went up as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine that has caused our energy crisis and caused our cost of living crisis. So by tackling the climate change crisis, we will help prevent us being as exposed and as vulnerable to future problems, which we see from time to time with the volatility in the price of fossil fuels.
Well, Jess, the government would no doubt say that it is doing that. It's putting a real focus in these plans on nuclear and a confirmation of the launch of the Great British Nuclear, which is going to focus on small reactors in particular. They also say that they're incentivising renewables as well. Now, you touched on this before. Are you satisfied that those elements of the plan go far enough?
Well, actually, there's quite a disconnect at the moment and not a very level playing field between the tax breaks and the investment allowances that the oil and gas industry get compared to those that the renewables industry get. For example, in the windfall tax on oil and gas companies, everybody knows that they've made huge windfall profits over the past year or so. There's an investment allowance there that allows them to claim back 90p in every pound they spend, but there isn't one of those for renewables investment. So, the renewables industry are saying to the government, you're saying you're going to need lots more investment into this renewables industry in the UK, yet you're giving the oil and gas companies more tax breaks and more investment allowances than we get. So there's a bit of a confusion with the energy security strategy here. What is the plan for decarbonising our homes? And as Bob says, moving away from oil and gas will help us to shield from future volatility in those markets. So there's a lot left to be desired by today's plans, and the renewables industry, as an investor, you're going to look at the UK and look at it in the context of what the US are offering, the EU are offering, and you might just choose to go there instead.
And very briefly, Jess, is there enough detail on what the plans are to perhaps allow for onshore wind?
Well, in the documents that I've seen so far, no, there's no real mention of onshore wind. It's not clear how the government plans on lifting the ban as they've said they will. They've talked a lot about local consultation and local approvals, but there's no clear plan for how they're going to try and achieve this. And onshore wind is one of the cheapest, if not the cheapest, source of power. So it could really help to lower our bills in the long term and shield us from those spiky gas prices. But a lack of clarity is just not helpful for people who are looking to invest in the UK, nor is it helpful for our bills, which are still high despite the gas price falling a little bit.
And Bob, one way of reducing bills and emissions is to reduce demand, to stop us using so much energy. The government is talking about helping insulate 300,000 of the poorest performing homes as far as insulation is concerned. They're also trying to extend this scheme to make it cheaper for people to install heat pumps. So are they doing enough on that front?
Well, the real secret here is the government's got to, at this stage, when a lot of these alternative fossil fuels are still a little bit more expensive than the fossil fuel alternative, is that the government needs to provide support to consumers and businesses to be able to introduce them. Now, at the moment, it's got this boiler upgrade scheme that is meant to bring down the price of heat pumps to make them equivalent to the price of a new gas boiler, but that's not good enough. In order to get the kind of really strong move towards heat pumps, which we have to do, then you're going to need to make it cheaper in the short run. We know that we expect over the long run, and that as you manufacture more heat pumps, the cost of production will come down, and eventually it will be cheaper anyway, just on the open market, to buy a heat pump rather than a gas boiler. But at the moment, the government is not investing enough. Similarly, with electric cars, we need to make electric cars cheaper to buy at the moment than their petrol or diesel equivalent.
I'm just going to squeeze in one more question, Jess, to you. The government was forced to produce this revised plan because the High Court found that its strategy didn't meet its climate targets. Have they plugged the gap?
It remains unclear, to be perfectly honest. There's a lot of documents to get through, a lot of pages of writing, and there's some discussion about whether the government has released just so much today to try and distract from the fact that it maybe hasn't done what it said it was going to do in terms of our emissions reductions. But let's be clear about this. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in a recent report said that if we don't reach net zero, climate change will not be halted and the impacts will get worse, including those here in the UK, like droughts and heat waves. So this really is a matter of urgency.
OK, well, Jess Rawson and Bob Ward, really good to get your expertise and your views on this. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, just a reminder that you can catch The Climate Show with Tom Heap this weekend. That's at 3 p.m. and 7:30 p.m. on Saturday and Sunday. And this week, Tom's in Sussex looking at a project to restore Britain's lost kelp forests. But that's all for today. Thanks for watching.